Don't have my... Good morning, everyone, and welcome to another sutta study here with Empty Cloud Monastery. So today I'll be speaking a little bit about a couple verses from the Dhammapada, but we can start by paying homage to the Buddhas. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. So, as mentioned, today we'll be having a look at some of the discourses from some of the verses from the Dhammapada. So, starting with the first two verses of the Dhammapada. So, these are very famous verses. And one of the reasons I want to talk about these is, first off, it gives a very clear explanation of the Buddhist concept of the mind and how our mind relates to reality. And second, because these two verses are in Pali, they're quite simple and straightforward, but there's a lot of different translations of these verses which can make it seem quite confusing or unclear. So I find it really helpful to return to these verses to really get a sense as to what the Buddha was trying to say here. So the first verse here, it starts off, Mano pubangama dhamma, mano seta, mano maya. So this is the opening statement. And this statement alone is an incredibly powerful and important statement. So mano is mind. In fact, it's etymologically, it's related to the English word mind. So mano is mind. Pubangama means going first. So pubangama means the precedent or the forerunner. So that which leads everything else. So mano pubangama dhamma. So dhamma in its broadest sense means all things, all phenomena. So everything that appears in the entire world. So all objects whatsoever are called dhammas. So mano pubangama dhamma. So this is saying that all things are preceded by the mind. All things are led by the mind. The mind is what goes first. So mind is the leader of all things, the precedent of all things. And the next statement here is mano seta. So again, we have this word mano, mind, and seta. So seta means the best, the highest, the supreme, the most powerful, the most magnificent. So mano seta is saying mind is the best of all things, the most powerful of all things. The supreme among all things. And then the next one is mano maya. So maya means created by. So mano maya means created by the mind. So this is saying all things are created by the mind. So this first line of the Dhammapada, again, it's saying all things are preceded by the mind. In other words, the mind comes before everything else. The mind exists before anything else exists. Second, the mind is the most powerful of all things, the supreme of all things. So nothing else is more powerful than the mind. Nothing else has control over the mind. And third, all things are created by the mind. So this also is, again, an extremely important statement. So it's basically the direct opposite of the prevailing materialist standpoint that the mind is created by the brain, that physical matter comes together in a particular configuration and that creates a mind. But the Buddhist standpoint is the opposite. First, there is the mind, and the conditions of mind create an experience of physicality, create an experience of a body in a physical world. But it's the mind that comes first, it's the mind that controls things, and it's the mind that creates things. So that's what this first verse of the Dhammapada is stating. So it's giving this very clear statement of the primacy of mind. So mind is the most primal of all things. Mind is that which is there before anything else. And mind is more powerful than anything else. So mind exerts control over all other things, but the mind is not controlled by those things. And finally, the mind creates everything else. The mind is not created by other things. So this right here is the basis of a extremely influential thread in Buddhist philosophy that among the early schools of Buddhism, it was particularly associated with the Yogavatara school. Yogacara school. So the Yogacara school, which was later came to be known as the mind-only school. So this was a thread of Buddhist thought, which again was presenting exactly the same concepts that we see in these verses. This idea that ultimately the highest reality is mind. And so in all of samsara, the mind is the fundamental ground for everything else. So this thread of thought then became the basis of all Mahayana and Vajrayana teachings. So all of them are ultimately traced back to this idea that everything is mind. And it's worth pointing out that we have exactly the same concept as one of the central concepts in the Pali Canon as well. So sometimes when one mentions the mind-only philosophy, sometimes people will think that's exclusively a Mahayana concept. But as we can see, it's something which is present in the Pali Canon as well. And in many, many places. This line of the Dhammapada is one of the most well-known, but it's far from the only place in the Pali Canon where this idea is presented. So then it continues, it says, Manasa che purutena basativa karotiva. So that means if you say or do anything with a corrupted mind, with a mind that is under the influence of any kind of defilements or unwholesome intentions or unwholesome mind states. So manasa che purutena. So puruta means corrupted, flawed, distorted. So if you say or do anything with a corrupted mind, and the next line is tato nang dukkhaman veti, then dukkha follows from that. And it gives the simile, chakang va vahato padang. So chakang means wheel, vahato means to follow or to carry, and padang can mean either foot or path. So there's many ways to interpret this simile that the Buddha is giving. So literally it means as a wheel follows a track, or as a wheel follows a foot. So you'll commonly see this translated in very creative ways, talking about oxen pulling wagons and so on, but that's all inventiveness. The simile itself simply says, as a wheel follows a path, or as a wheel follows a foot. But setting aside the simile, the point here is quite simple. The point is that if we speak or act using a corrupted mind, then what follows from that is suffering. What follows from that is dukkha, discomfort, anguish, confusion, misery. Because again, ultimately, all phenomena are created by the mind. So if we're operating with a defiled, flawed, corrupted mind, then the reality that we're going to experience is a flawed, distorted, uncomfortable reality. So this also then is pointing to the functioning of karma. So it's giving a very clear example of how karma works. This also is a point where there's often a lot of confusion. This idea that karma represents some external force of judgment that inflicts punishment on the wrongdoers and so on. But here the Buddha is giving a very simple example. He's saying if you act from a corrupted mind, then you're going to get corrupted results. Reminds me of the old axiom in computer coding, garbage in, garbage out. If you put garbage into a system, then you'll get garbage out of a system. If you're trying to clean a surface, but you're using a filthy rag, then you might wind up just making the surface even dirtier. So if you have a nice clean table and you go at it with an oily, greasy, muddy rag, then is that table going to still be clean afterwards? Probably not. It's probably going to be worse off than when you started. So similarly, when we take a dirty, filthy mind and we start smearing over reality with a dirty, filthy mind, what's going to happen? Or similarly, if you're creating something, so for example, if you have a brown marker and you try to create something with a brown marker, you're going to get something brown. Now you draw a picture with a brown marker, you get a brown picture. So similarly, if you try to create your experience using a corrupted or stained mind, then you're going to get a similarly corrupted and stained and defiled reality. That will be your experience of the world. So it's the lens through which we see things. If you see the world through a dirty, messy, muddled lens, then the world is going to look dirty, messy, and muddled. So this is all happening in the immediate present moment. So this is another question which comes up about karma, which is this question, well, how does karma operate over time? And the answer is it doesn't need to operate over time. Karma operates right here in the present moment. All your karma is in your mind right now. And all the karma in your mind right now is influencing how your mind generates its experience. So all that karma in your mind, that karma of hostility and resentment and greed, that karma of hurting and stealing and lying and cheating, all of that karma is in your mind right now. So that means all of the experiences being generated by your mind are being generated through the lens of all those unwholesome patterns and memories and activities in the mind. So naturally, it's going to generate a corresponding reality, a reality which is characterized by dukkha, characterized by all the pain and misery and anguish that we've inflicted in the past. Then the corresponding pair to this, so the first chapter of the Dhammapada is the chapter of pairs. So it's set up as matched pairs of teachings. So the matched pair for this one is, similarly, it starts off with the same very important statement, Mano Pubangama Dhamma, Mano Seta, Mano Maya. So all phenomena are preceded by the mind, controlled by the mind, and created by the mind. So this is, again, this critically important statement about the primacy of mind. But then it changes. The next line says, Manasa che pasannena pasativa karotiva. So previously it was saying if you act with a corrupted mind, so padutta, corrupted mind. But here it's saying if you act with a pasanna mind. So the word pasanna, it has a few different meanings. So the meaning here is clear or pure. So the word prasanna also has a number of other meanings. It can also mean faithful. So in the sense of one who has a lot of faith in the Buddha's teachings, that would be one usage of this word. It can also mean joyful or happy. But commonly, we do see this word prasanna used in this very simple meaning of clear or pure. So that appears to be the usage that's being used here. So in contrast to padutta, so padutta means corrupted or defiled. So then prasanna means clear and pure. So manasa chepasanena vasativa karotiva. So if you speak or act with a clear and pure mind. And the Buddha says, tato nang sukhaman veeti. He says, then sukha follows from that. The happiness or pleasure follows from that. And he gives the simile, cha ya va anapayani. So as your shadow never departs. So wherever you go, your shadow always comes with you. It's always right there with you. And usually we think of a shadow as something that follows us. But actually, if you look closely, look at your own shadow. Depending upon the light source, your shadow might be in front of you or behind you or to the left of you or to the right of you. But one thing is always true about your shadow, and that it's always right where you are. So similarly, this is pointing to the immediate present moment characteristic of karma. So when we speak or act with a clear and pure mind, then that means right in that moment we experience sukha. Right in that moment we have happiness and pleasure. Right in that moment we'll start generating a pleasant reality, an enjoyable experience of the world. And of course that also creates patterns. So the longer you've been committed to wholesome conduct, then the more clear and pure the patterns of your mind will be. And therefore, the more predominantly pleasant your experience of reality will be. So this is a very direct way of understanding karma, a very direct way of understanding how the immediate mind state that we have in the present moment determines the pleasantness or unpleasantness of our present moment experience, but also how the habitual patterns of mental activity over a long period of time then affect the overall shape and character of our experience. They influence how we generate our experience of reality in each moment. And that's, again, that's a very important point that the Buddha is making in these two Dhammapada verses, is the point that we generate our own experience of reality. So commonly we think of the world as being objective, self-existent objects, which we then interact with. But this is not something which has any support in the Buddhist teachings. It's not something which you can find support for anywhere in either the Theravada or Mahayana schools of thought. Instead, we see the idea that we generate our own experience of reality. With our own mind, we generate the appearance of objects. But all of that is a mental process. And it's a mental process which therefore is determined by our states of mind. And our states of mind are determined by our habitual activities and actions. So again, putting down this idea of any kind of permanent, ongoing, self-existent object, and instead relating to the world as a mirror for our own mind, a mirror of our own mental activities and patterns. And using that mirror as a way of clearly understanding where we still have defilements and delusions that need to be addressed and resolved so that we can make progress towards true happiness. So I think that's all I have to say this morning on these verses.
Annamayam Dhammakataya sadhukaram nadamase.
Sadhu, 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 anumodami. Okay, so at this time I can take any questions that you have. I see there's a few questions showing up. So welcome to all the people who are joining in. It's wonderful to see all of you with us this morning. So the first question is from Geetha. So Geetha says, when one reaches Nibbana, does the mind cease without remainder at the moment of death? Well, it depends on what you mean by mind, and it depends on what you mean by cease, and it depends on what you mean by without remainder. So we would need to get some pretty clear definition of terms for each of these things. So one thing that one does need to be very careful about is speculating about the ongoing existence of an awakened being after the point of death. So in the suttas, the Buddha clearly states that it is not accurate to say that an awakened being continues to exist after death. It is also not accurate to say that they cease to exist after death. It is not accurate to say that they both exist and don't exist after death. And it's not accurate to say that they neither exist nor do not exist after death. So he says that the ideas of existence and non-existence simply don't apply to an awakened being, even while they're alive, even more so after the death of the body. And although this is very clearly stated, again, in both Theravada and Mahayana, it's very clearly stated. Nonetheless, there do tend to be these tendencies of, in the Theravada school, commonly people form the opinion that enlightened beings cease to exist after death, so falling on the side of non-existence at the point of death. And in the Mahayana school, people commonly tend to believe that enlightened beings exist eternally and forever after death. But both of these viewpoints are, of course, flat out rejected by the Buddha. So we should be very careful about falling into that kind of speculation. And recognize that what we're doing is we're projecting our own delusional concepts onto beings which are beyond delusion. We're projecting samsaric frameworks onto that which is not affected by samsara. So it's not relevant. So the Buddha, he says that the ideas of existence and non-existence are not relevant to awakened beings. They don't apply. It's like asking me what the color purple smells like. Well, it just doesn't make any sense. The question doesn't make any sense. It's using words which don't apply to the subject. Geetha also asks, if we practice the Noble Eightfold Path, are we training to watch our mind movements with wisdom and mindfulness? Yeah, that's correct. Yeah. Then Anita asks, is the purified mind the chitta? Chitta just means mind. So whether the mind is purified or not, you can still call it chitta. So chitta just means mind. So you ask, is the purified mind the chitta? Well, I would say the purified chitta is the purified mind. And I would say the defiled chitta is the defiled mind. But either way, it's just chitta. And chitta, like everything else, it is impermanent, impersonal, constantly arising and ceasing. It's just as insubstantial and ephemeral as everything else. So chitta is a sankhara. And like all sankharas, it is ultimately unreal. It has no permanent, lasting essence. And Geetha also asks, in our understanding, the cessation of mind, is it the cessation of karmic formations? So is the cessation of mind the cessation of karmic formations? Well, when mind is not operating, then intention is not operating, which then means, karma is not operating. Yeah, that's true. Yeah. So that would apply to the Nibbana Dhatu. I can't imagine what else it would apply to. Then AS asks, how can we use the mind to better distinguish sensation from feeling? Well, I'm not quite sure what Pali word you mean by sensation. So normally we use the Pali word Vedana, which can be translated either as feeling or as sensation. So Vedana is commonly translated as feeling, but some translators translate it as sensation. So you would need to define your terms. What do you mean by sensation and what do you mean by feeling? Because if I were to translate your sentence into Pali, I would say, how do we distinguish Vedana from Vedana, which doesn't apply. So what do you mean by sensation and what do you mean by feeling? I could assign meanings to these words and then give explanations for those meanings, but that may have no relevance to what you're trying to ask. For example, if I assume that by feeling you mean Vedana, and by sensation you mean the mental constructs and proliferations related to that Vedana, then I could give an answer based on that. So Vedana is the raw experience of pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral in relation to a sensory contact. So there is a sensory contact which we assign the label of pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral to. And that's something which happens very quickly and immediately. So if you're paying close attention with sharp mindfulness and wisdom, then you can catch that immediately. And you can know there is just this sense contact, which is being labeled as pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. Then you can recognize that all of the meaning and concepts and ideas that we pile on top of that are all extra and unnecessary. It's not who we are, and it's not innate in the sensory experience itself, and it's not innate in the feeling itself. On the other hand, if by sensation you instead mean the raw sense contact, then once again, pay close attention. And you'll recognize that the sense contact is one thing, and the experience of pleasure or pain or neutrality is another thing. So ultimately, it comes through mindfulness and samadhi, actually. So very sharp, clear attention with a very still and steady mind. This is how you can distinguish these, actually 3 distinct steps in the process. So there's sense contact, such as seeing something or hearing something. Then there is Vedana, which is liking means it's pleasant, disliking means it's unpleasant, non-reactivity means it's neutral. Then there's Papancha. So the whole process of sanya and sankhara, so perception and mental activity generating all the stories and concepts related to that experience. Yeah, you can piece apart these 3 things. Yeah, through mindfulness, equanimity, samadhi. This is how you do it. Then Aya says, can you please repeat which Dhammapada verse was referenced? Verses 1 and 2. So the very first 2 verses in the whole Dhammapada. Kumo asks, what is the relation between Dhammapada and the suttas? Can the verses be directly connected with a single sutta, or do they refer to Buddhist teachings in general? So the Dhammapada it's attributed to the Buddha, so it's believed to be a set of short, poetic teachings that the Buddha gave. Some of them do appear in other suttas. Most of them don't. Most of them exist only as standalone verses in the Dhammapada. So they were probably originally part of larger teachings that the Buddha gave, of which only the poetic verse is what's been preserved over the subsequent centuries after the Buddha passed away. But that's speculation. I suppose it's possible that the Buddha just one day just randomly produced a couple verses and somebody memorized it. But I suspect it was probably part of larger bodies of teachings, and the verse portion was preserved and eventually compiled into the Dhammapada. So most of it appears only in the Dhammapada, but some of the Dhammapada verses appear in other suttas as well. So A has clarified, body sensations of physical pain versus feelings like sadness. Okay, so in this case, you were using the word sensation to mean Vedana. And by feeling, you seem to be referring to sanya sankhara, as I mentioned earlier. So sanya and sankhara are where the experiences of emotion arise. So sanya is when we identify and label and conceptualize a sensation. And sankhara is the mental activities and programs related to that. So emotion arises in sanya sankhara, which happen after Vedana. So again, the way of practicing is the same. Mindfulness, concentration, equanimity. Then as you pay very close attention, you can piece these things apart. Emphasizing once again that it is critical to have very strong samadhi. I can't emphasize enough the value of samadhi. Without a very still, steady, and bright mind, you will not catch the subtleties of your experience. Then Geetha asks, what is the difference between mind and consciousness? Well, that's an interesting one. Once again, it depends on what exactly you mean by mind. So one way of talking, for example, in the five khandhas, the five components of being. So you have rupa, vedana, sanya, sankhara, vijnana. So normally we would call vijnana consciousness. But all four of vedana, sanya, sankhara, and vijnana, all four of those are called mind. They're called mano. So here then we have this distinction that mano then is feeling, perception, activity, and consciousness. But consciousness is only one component of mind, whereas mind includes all these other mental activities as well. So that's one place where we see a distinction. So consciousness then, in the sense of vijnana, seems to refer particularly to awareness of a sensory world, whereas mind encompasses all of the mental activities that we engage in, which may or may not have anything to do with sensory experience or sensory data. So that's one way of answering this question. But there's also a few places in the suttas where vijnana seems to be used to mean mind in general, but that's not very common. Normally it's used specifically in the sense of sensory awareness. Then Buddha Richie says, as you mentioned, the verses are deceptively simple. I am attracted to the simple and opposed to the intricate. So are the straightforward verses such as these sufficient, or do we need to work with the more complex systems as well? Well, Aaron, ultimately, the question is what benefits you? What helps you make progress towards awakening? So simple teachings tend to be very powerful in their directness and clarity. But they also are prone to misinterpretation. So one of the value of going through more complex teachings, as you find in longer suttas, for example, is that they help to give us enough context to help to clarify the underlying meaning. So for example, when I first read the Dhammapada was actually the very first Buddhist scripture I ever read. as is commonly the case for many Buddhists. It was the very first scripture I ever read. And actually, it was one of the first Buddhist books of any sort that I ever read. So when I very first started getting interested in Buddhism as a teenager, the first two books that I read were the Dhammapada, and I don't remember whose translation. This was a very long time ago. At the time, I didn't even realize how many different translations there were. So the Dhammapada and Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind by Shunryu Suzuki Roshi, the first two Buddhist books that I read. So I read the Dhammapada and I thought I knew what it was talking about. But in retrospect, I really didn't have any idea whatsoever. Didn't understand it one bit. And it was only after I'd been practicing for many, many years and I'd read through all of the other suttas and I came back to the Dhammapada, then was when I started to understand what it was talking about. And that was when I realized that on my first read through, so many years ago, 20 years ago now, on my first read through, I didn't understand it at all. Didn't get it one bit. So that's the downside of these very short, simple verses, is that it's very easy to misunderstand them, or it's very easy to miss their depth of meaning. So the Dhammapada is beautiful, but it's meant to be taken in the context of all of the other suttas. Otherwise, it's very easy to miss the meaning. And that's the end of the questions. Any questions from the monastery residents? You have a question?
In my early days, I was told that the Dhammapada was based on Buddha's samsara of his previous lives. Is that accurate?
So you're saying you were taught that the Dhammapada was based on the Buddha's previous lives?
The stories from his life.
I've never heard this before. Yeah, I don't know.
It's the Jataka tales.
The Jataka tales are based on the Buddha's past lives. But the Dhammapada, yeah, I haven't heard it being said in that way. I mean, some of the traditional commentarial explanations of the Dhammapada is relating it to certain past lives. But many of the Dhammapada verses appear to be references to events that were happening at the time of the Buddha. Many of them are also just general Dhamma teachings, which aren't connected to any particular event or place or time. So definitely some of them do seem to be references to events from past lives, but definitely not all of them or even most of them. Okay. Then, okay, we have a couple more questions. Anita says, which translation should one start with of the Dhammapada? Well, you should start by learning Pali and reading through the rest of the Sutta Pitaka in Pali. Then you should read the Dhammapada in Pali. That's what you should do. If you're asking which translation you should start with, though, well, I mean, there's literally dozens of Dhammapada translations. And even I produced a Dhammapada translation, though it's not currently online anywhere. Yeah, grab a handful and read all of them and compare them to each other. And you'll also get a sense as to how radically differently different people translate these verses. There's a couple which over the years I've come to appreciate as being a little bit more precise than most of the others. So Bhante Buddharakkhita's translation is pretty good. Gil Fronsdale's translation is also not bad. Those two are the top of the list of ones that I might recommend. But even both of those have some pretty distinct flaws in them, which are a little uncomfortable once you know Pali. You can pick out where translations are not quite the best. So there really is no comparison for learning Pali and reading the suttas in Pali. But if you want specific recommendations, yeah, I would say Bhante Buddharakkita, Gil Fronsdale, those two translations are pretty good. One of these days I'll edit my own translation and post it, but not today. Then Victor asks, what do you think about the Dhammapada Atthakata? So the Atthakata is the commentary, which was produced 1,000 years after the Buddha. What do I think about it? I think it often misses the point of the verses, to be perfectly honest. I think it often takes profound teachings and oversimplifies them. It often puts irrelevant stories on verses, which distorts the original meaning. So I recommend reading the Dhammapada without reading the commentary. I don't think the commentary really adds anything helpful. In fact, quite the opposite. I think it usually generates confusion rather than clarity. And especially in the case of the Dhammapada, I feel that's especially true. It generates confusion rather than clarity. Victor asks, is the Dhammapada part of the suttas? Yes, yes. Then Shadow of Label has an off-topic question that can wait for Mug Chat. And that's the end of the questions. So if there's nothing else, okay, we can go ahead and end the session with 3 sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And we'll see you next time.